Good afternoon and welcome to midweek NEST briefing Inside Out. NEST is a new Eurasian strategy center. We're based in London and Washington, DC. We analyze Russia and the surrounding region. My name is Katia Glod. I am Deputy Head of Foreign Policy at NEST, and I'm joined today by my boss, John Lough, Senior Policy Fellow at NEST. Today we are going to talk about the recent developments as dramatic events unfold. We'll talk about the ceasefire negotiations, particularly the phone conversation that took place between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. We'll talk about the European response to this and broader geopolitical implications. And I will start straight away with my first question. So, John, could you just briefly walk us through the latest phone conversation between President Trump and Putin? Would you consider it a success, a failure for the Western side? What's your view on that?
Well, it's certainly far from being a failure in the sense that the conversation is still continuing. Obviously, from President Trump's perspective, it fell short of what he was seeking, which was a comprehensive ceasefire. And they had to go back then to this old idea that was originally, in fact, put forward by the Ukrainians last summer before the Kursk offensive, which was to have a moratorium on airstrikes on energy infrastructure. So that's a kind of starting point for Trump, but he's obviously going to want to get further. But you can see very clearly the game that the Kremlin is playing here, which is to broaden the discussion, to try and establish the key points for the bigger framework that they're looking at. They're in some ways on a different time scale. They never wanted to talk about or just simply have a ceasefire. They want to have this broader peace settlement. So you can see very much from the Kremlin statement on Tuesday evening that they've got their strategy in place and they're following this.
Right, very interesting. Before I go to the next question, I would like to remind that you can pose your questions in our chat or use the Q&A function. So what is the Kremlin strategy then, John? What is it seeking to do? Can we just recap it once again from our previous last week's conversation?
The ultimate strategy is to subjugate Ukraine. And the way to do that is to ensure that it can't defend itself adequately, that it can't enter any military alliances with partner countries, and that ultimately you can change or find a way of changing the leadership in Ukraine to take a position that's more, how shall I say, sympathetic towards Russia or understanding of Russia's interests. Those are clearly the Russian goals, and we've heard them repeated many, many times through the last 3 years of this big war. So the Russian terminology, of course, is denazification, which means removing the Zelensky administration, demilitarization, which I think is going to become more and more the issue that the Russian side focuses on. And that's going to, I think, for the American side, create certain problems because of Europe.
Yes, indeed. Europe is becoming a powerful geopolitical player here in this conflict in particular. It's not all about just US and Russia, and we have seen the recent summits that take place basically weekly. We see leaders gathering in Europe. We see them gathering here in London. There are online conversations. So how is Europe trying to promote its role here? What can it do? And how is Kremlin also trying to exploit this role?
Well, this is a very interesting question, because if we look at the sort of public dimension of it, you would have the impression that the Europeans are creating some sort of peacekeeping force to send to Ukraine. Now, I personally think this is something of a sideshow. Of course, if we do reach that point where we have arrangements in place that provide for a durable ceasefire, having a proper way of monitoring it and indeed enforcing it if possible would be absolutely key. And we know from past experience from 2015 onwards in Donbass that this is highly problematic. the monitoring mission under the aegis of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, had a really tough time, and it was just not an effective way of trying to enforce a ceasefire. It was simply a monitoring mission. So European countries are talking about this with some resolve that we want to put this together. We're going to have resources. There are more and more countries that are talking about contributing. But in reality, without a US guarantee, or backstop is the kind of fashionable word now, I really don't see that this is going to happen easily unless European countries have the courage to put their troops on the ground and potentially face danger. So you've got that discussion going on. Parallel to it, a little bit less audible right now, is the question of actually how we keep Ukraine fighting, and whether Europe is in a position to do that, to take up the slack where we can assume that the US is not going to provide another substantial package, even if President Trump talked yesterday about finding Patriot missiles to keep the air defenses in Ukraine functioning, which is in some ways an important pronouncement on his part. But can Europe really step up and provide Ukraine with the arms, the ammunition, indeed the training to keep Ukraine fighting? And here we, I think, get into a situation where Europe is going to probably have a very tough conversation with the Trump administration. Because if President Zelensky's determination to continue fighting angered President Trump in this notorious meeting in the White House, if it's seen from Washington that the Europeans are the ones emboldening the Ukrainian side and actually preventing, as a result, the type of peace that the US and Russia, I think together, in some ways, they would like to impose, then that's going to create some serious frictions between Europe and the United States. So we're going to see, I think, some really interesting things emerge over the coming weeks. Europe, and I include the United Kingdom in this definition, I think is going to play an important role in determining how the next phase of these negotiations proceed. And the US has pretty much said that if we get beyond just a ceasefire and we talk about the peace settlement arrangements, then Europe is going to have to be there at the table in some form. So this is all ahead of us.
Yes, indeed. And that's what President Putin also demanded. He demanded the halt to intelligence sharing, which is something that indeed is very hard for Europe to provide. Perhaps that's the weakest point. But do you think that Putin is concerned at all about these acts, these steps that Europe has been taking recently, including the UK, and how emboldened its narrative is? Or does he think that he can again outplay Europe and drag out negotiations and ultimately sow discord between different countries? Because obviously one thing is the Baltic countries, Poland, the UK, we can see now France, that it has been really at the front. This foreign policy agenda has become part of its domestic debate. But then what about other countries, Italy, Spain? What do you think Putin is expecting, and how do you think this will play out?
Well, we've seen in recent years, the Kremlin has been extremely dismissive of Europe and regards it as weak, divided, and with divisions, in fact, that are very exploitable. And there's no doubt Russia's used various tools, and its energy diplomacy before 2022 was a big part of that. But other aspects of sabotage, disinformation, and all these things, and Russia is still very active in those areas. But I suspect that this shock of the United States retreating from Europe one can sense that this is galvanizing some European countries. And I think it would be premature for Russia to write off Europe's capability here to find both the will and ultimately the means to defend itself adequately, and also to defend its interests beyond its borders. And if we go back to just this question of how you police a ceasefire, whether Europe, there's this discussion of the so-called Sky Shield initiative, whether 120 European fighter jets could actually achieve what a 10,000 peacekeeping force could do on the ground. This might be a substitute, and I think would be actually a very good test of Europe's capabilities. But to me, the really significant event this last week was the lifting of the debt brake in Germany, and the possibility that now Germany will make a serious effort to rebuild its defences and become an active player in the European defence scene. I mean, back in the Cold War days, West Germany had a substantial and capable army. But over the last more than 30 years, that potential has just drained away because the armed forces have been so consistently underfunded, I mean, to a really shocking extent.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And of course, that also ties up to another point and tactic that Putin tried to exploit, which was to try to move the conversation to broader geostrategic economic interests, which could bind both the United States and Russia. And indeed, Nord Stream #2, that's another issue that has come up, speaking about Germany. And Germany, of course, is the country which Russia has been able to exploit very well. And the situation might have changed now, but to what extent, I suppose it's very hard. It's very hard to say. Do you think that there are other issues that Russia could exploit, could sell them as very attractive ideas, for example, to Washington, which Washington would be happy to push for? I'm thinking about the Arctic. I'm thinking about the Northern Sea route. What's your view on that? And what else is there that the Kremlin could potentially sell to President Trump and to his kind of, deal-like approach?
Well, I think these are very, very important questions. I mean, I think we can see in the Russian negotiating tactic, they obviously want to lift sanctions. And the way they're trying to do this is to appeal to President Trump's instinct that it would be good for US business to return to the Russian market. Not that, to my mind, that it had a particularly substantial presence there even before the war, but it's a way of attracting Trump's attention, encouraging him to look more in that direction and away from the real sort of heavy-duty military political issues. So I think we will see more of that. And here we're going to have probably also a conflict between the US and the EU over the lifting of sanctions. And supposedly the US and EU negotiators have been in contact, discussing this issue. And the EU's got a problem rolling over sanctions, obviously, because of the position of Hungary and Slovakia. And both those countries feel emboldened now with the return to power of Donald Trump. But as far as Nord Stream is concerned, and supplies of Russian gas to Europe, I think for Germany it's a case of once bitten, twice shy. They always argued that even through the worst days of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and then of course succeeded by Russia, they had always been a reliable supplier. And that argument simply can't be made. I mean, it in fact wasn't entirely correct at the time, but it simply can't be made now. Because in 2022, Russia ran down supplies through Nord Stream very deliberately, and then finally cut them off through Nord Stream 1, then Nord Stream 2 was sabotaged. I do think over time, it's possible that there will be some further gas deliveries even through Nord Stream, but this is not going to happen short term. But there are some parts of German industry which, of course, are interested in restoring these links.
Yes, it's interesting when we talk about these more economic geostrategic interests of the US. It's how this debate on sanctions has developed. For example, Russia has been, of course, trying to deny that sanctions have made a huge impact on the country. And we know that, indeed, it has managed to sustain the war effort now for 3 years. And economists believe that there is at least space for another year, maybe more, some say 5 or even longer. But at the same time, I found it quite striking that before the phone conversation with President Trump, Putin was at a meeting of the Russian industrial and entrepreneurship union, yes. And how many people actually were getting up and talking about sanctions, coming up to the microphone and saying that, well, what can we do about this? Maybe we should set up some sort of commission, and we can see all together, find with our allies, see whether we can establish a system that they did not use the word second-band, but that's what they meant. So it's clearly, it seems that Putin is worried about sanctions, and his business people around him, the business elites in Russia, are obviously worried about sanctions. And maybe that's why after this public part of the conversation, Putin then wants to talk to the businessmen privately. And apparently he was again trying to justify the war, saying that as was reported by a Russian journalist, that he explains that the West should have stopped earlier, recognized Crimea, then recognized the 4 territories which Russia has partly annexed, and reportedly he even said that Russia would not take Odessa if the line stop here. But apart from the economic interests, do you see that how Putin also, the Kremlin readout of the conversation also mentions the discussions about the Middle East? And do you think that there is some potential that Putin would try to use its leverage over Iran? I mean, obviously, the last thing that Putin wants is some sort of deal between Iran and the US. We know that the American president had sent a letter inviting Iran for another discussion. But it seems that for Putin, the last thing that he desires would be Iranian oil coming on the world market. So what do you think what do you think Russia could offer to the US with regard to more security discussions and help in the Middle East region?
Well, I think we will see certainly a return to some diplomacy to try to discourage Iran from further development of its nuclear technologies. And it's striking that President Trump, having broken off that agreement back in 2018, the JCPOA, which also got exactly what that stands for, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that he wants to return to some discussion with Iran. From what I understand from the people who watch that part of the world more closely than I do, what the Iranians are concerned about is that there'll be a deal between Russia and the US that sells them out.
Yeah.
So how they play this is going to be very, very interesting indeed. Russia was more dependent on Iran at the start of the war, and because of drones. And there's been an Iranian drone facility, I believe, that established in Russia, which now is producing drones quite effectively. And that's so that dependency may have been somewhat reduced. Russia's then, I mean, at the end of the day, lost positions in Syria, which are really quite significant. Yeah. So is Iran such a valuable ally these days? Probably not. But as always, Russian diplomacy will be looking to keep balance, exploit the advantages they may have. And the very fact, I think, that Trump is trying to reach out to Iran gives Russia a certain opportunity for sure.
Yes, absolutely. Last time we also talked about how Russia is now managing to bring the conversation back to this sort of great power debate and trying to divide the world into the spheres of influence. But is there anything which could actually spur President Putin not to continue the war? For example, at this moment, what I meant with this, by my allusion to that discussion that we had last week, is that in a way, Russia is already talking to America. So it's gaining its sort of direct bilateral discussion. It's sort of trying, and maybe successfully trying, to bypass the Europeans. There is a lot of talk about Russian-American businesses, first of all, coming back to Russia, and Putin indeed talked about that a lot before the conversation with President Trump. So you could argue that the Kremlin is happy to just gain, stabilize the gains which they have both in Ukraine and on this more geopolitical front, to kind of try to redraw the maps, try to redraw the power narratives. But is there, if we look, more broadly, is there anything that could push President Putin and the Kremlin to want to stop the war? Are there any domestic considerations? I can imagine like mobilization has always been an issue. Is there anything else that could potentially suggest to us that actually there are also losses for Russia in this war and that it might be more open to these negotiations?
Well, I mean, firstly, I think there have been absolutely colossal losses for Russia as a result of this war. And it's not just the physical losses. I mean, the human capital, the economic capital. It's the country's global reputation. And I think in the elites generally, this war is not as popular as might be suggested. And you just alluded to business before. Yeah. So I think there are multiple reasons why Putin would like to get out of this relatively quickly. Mobilization, if Russia were to advance further into Ukraine, if it were trying to seize a big city or something like that, the current manpower levels would not be sufficient. I think the way Putin sees he can resolve this situation is to ultimately, with the support of the United States, bring about a situation in Ukraine itself where there is a change of leadership. And seemingly both Putin and Trump dislike Zelensky, even though Trump supposedly had a very good call yesterday with Zelensky, then relations are restored. But they see him and his administration as an obstacle. So I think there is a strong incentive for Putin to go for probably a long ceasefire, to try to change the internal dynamics. I say try to change the internal dynamics of Ukraine, and then see what comes out of it. And if need be, there might be, you might find a number of pretexts to continue fighting, accusing Ukrainians of sabotaging the ceasefire. I'm just watching Russian television last night. You've already got multiple, accusations that Ukraine is not abiding by this commitment not to strike energy infrastructure. We've got the whole war crimes narrative raging that the Ukrainians have allegedly committed all these atrocities in Kursk region. You can kind of see that they're playing this kind of longer game.
Yes. So what's in that case your short-term outlook? What do you think we can expect within the next couple of weeks, both militarily and politically? What should we be looking for?
I think first we will see a continuation of this discussion between Russia and the US, and probably some more details will start to emerge. And then I think we'll see on the Ukrainian side and in Europe a high degree of dissatisfaction with some of those terms, which of course are not decided ultimately, but are up there for discussion. And then I think we'll see the White House probably trying to put more pressure on Kiev again to accept at least some of those provisions. So this is going to be very messy. It's going to be a long, in my view, slow process. Although there are a lot of rumors that Putin would like to have this, wrapped up by the end of April, and then you've got the May 9th parade.
Yes, yeah.
But that looks to me to be ambitious.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. Let's now look at the questions. Okay, I don't think we've got any questions at the moment. Can we maybe talk a little bit more in that case about the positive side from the conversation between Trump and Putin for Ukraine? I think what was really noticed is that despite Putin not agreeing to a temporary ceasefire, at least the US side said did not agree with him to stop intelligence sharing immediately. And on the contrary, US president said that they would provide more air defense. Have you noticed anything else in terms of tangible progress from this tangible carrots that, maybe it's not the best words, but that Ukraine and Europe could pick up and develop further?
I've not seen anything so far that would suggest to me that the US is going to in fact be perhaps more generous to Ukraine than initially indicated, as a way perhaps of putting pressure on the Russian side. I have the impression that the US is still very tentative about maybe President Trump's trying to find his feet here in the way he deals with Putin. But Russia has been trying to set conditions throughout since these negotiations began, and the US has largely gone along with that. And there may be, some divisions within the US team itself, and it's striking that we have people there who do not have deep experience of negotiating with Russia. Steve Witkoff is a real estate guy and a close ally of President Trump, but he's not been in a high-level diplomatic negotiation of this kind, up against really formidable negotiators. Let's face it. So I think we're for the next round of negotiations, I think President Trump is going to have to regroup and think much harder about where he might have leverage and where he might be able to indicate to Putin that more compromises need to be made. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said at the outset that all sides are going to have to make compromises. But as somebody said to me recently, you've got to remember that Rubio is the secretary. And I don't wish to diminish his role, but the fact is he is not the ultimate decision maker here, and the signals are being sent by his boss, who really very much wishes to be in command.
And with President Trump alluding twice before to actually raising sanctions against Russia and tariffs, is that something you think that there is still some space for maneuvering? Do you think we know that the primary sanctions are the European sanctions against Russia, but is there anything the US can still do to close perhaps loopholes, do something with the energy, shadow energy fleet and insurance? Anything where that, as you said, that President Trump can use as a leverage?
I think it's got to be something more dramatic than just trying to close loopholes. And if it were a case of really displacing Russian oil from the global market, and perhaps if this were possible to encourage Saudi Arabia, for example, to pump more oil, that would definitely send a message. But it rather feels to me as though President Trump is in a position now where he's, if you like, he's developed this, as he would see it, goodwill on the part of the Russian side, that he's begun this conversation. And of course, he enticed them to the table by making concession after concession, that he might lose them. And so that's going to be an incentive maybe not to go down that route. So he's in a very, very delicate position here. To what extent that he's really worried about the Europeans being up in arms about the negotiating tactics. And we've even seen the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, extremely critical of this ceasefire. Whether he really cares about that is sort of difficult to say at this stage.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we have now some questions coming in. Maybe I'll try to take several of them. There was an article today in the Ukrainian news that Ukraine missed an opportunity to engage with the Russian opposition and establish a political foothold in Kursk. Do you think that would have changed Putin's response and the outcome in Kursk's incursion? Another question, also from an anonymous attendee. Do you think Russia's assumptions about the US will change if a more cooperative relationship develops? Or, on the contrary, will Putin assume that deep confrontation with the US will resume and plan accordingly? And I'll read out the third question and feel free to John, respond to those for which we still have time. Before the negotiations began, there was a lot of discussion of the idea that Trump would not want a deal that made him look weak. With little evidence of leverage being applied to Russia so far, how much is that a concern for him now? And what does he see as a strong deal?
Oh, those are good questions. Let me take the last one. I think as things stand, President Putin looks as though he's got much stronger cards. And not just that, he's playing those cards pretty competently. So President Trump has some ground to make up. And I think it's going to be a real test of whether he can do that, because otherwise he may well look like somebody who brought the war to an end, but in fact allowed Russia to win. So I don't think that's the result that he would like to achieve. There's a really important question there around the perception of the United States in Russia, and it's really striking to see how Russian media are now sort of bad-mouthing Europe, and it's all okay, fine of the US. The US has been extremely reasonable and understanding of the Russian position, and it just changes by the rhetoric changes by sort of 180 degrees. I tend to think that Putin will remain deeply distrustful of what he perceives as the US deep state. He harbors serious grievances towards the United States, which he will simply not be able to abandon. These are frustrations that have built up in him over decades, and we can go back to the 2007 Munich speech for really the first public manifestation of that. These things don't just go away. And in response to the first question, I mean, could Ukraine some way have sort of capitalized more on the incursion into the Kursk region, if I understand the question correctly, and explain the purpose of that incursion? Probably yes. I mean, at the time, it did seem on the part of Ukraine a very risky, brave operation, which certainly showed Ukraine had genuine military capacity, that it could maneuver forces in this way, and that above all, it could take Russia by surprise. And I think it showed that very, very effectively. And the Kremlin was then in this situation of just having to try to play it all down and say there's a bit of trouble on the border, but it rather suggested, and I'm sure it did to people across Russia, that the authorities just really do not care about their own population. At least that was one of the messages that emerged from that incursion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. We're overrun our time a little bit, but thank you very much to everyone who has joined us today. Please go to our website. Our discussion will be uploaded there shortly. Come and join us next Thursday, again, 3 p.m. London time. And do subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find on our website, and you can find the link to subscribe to it. Thank you very much.